Friends, good evening. Welcome. Good afternoon and good morning to those of you watching on Zoom in other parts of the world. It's evening here in Jerusalem. We're at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here and I do the English stuff here at the center, events, content, programming, seminars, that kind of thing. Many of you, I know, are familiar with me from your computer screens. I have a regular Zoom event, which many of you tune into, so it's nice to see you in person. Those of you who are not on my mailing list and would like to be, you can sign up on the sign-up sheets outside on your way out, if you didn't already on the way in. This is a really great excuse for an event, the birthday of Theodor Herzl, which the Hebrew birthday, which starts, I guess, around now, right? Sunset. It's a sort of accident of history that the state of Israel was established so close to Herzl's birthday. That certainly wasn't deliberate, but it does enable us to celebrate the day very close to Yom Ha'atzmaut. And on Yom Ha'atzmaut itself, we obviously think of that famous scene of Ben Gurion reading out the Declaration of Independence, and we also, especially because we've just mourned and remembered the fallen soldiers in Yom HaZikaron, we also think of the War of Independence and the price paid for our sovereignty. But of course, we don't get to 1948 and all of that without Herzl. We don't get to it without the man who declared in his diary after the first Zionist Congress, with what would have seemed to anyone who read it then as delusional, in Basel, I created the Jewish state, right? He said in 1897 that it might take 50 years, and he was almost right. It took 51 from then. And while there are no straight lines from Basel to Israel's establishment, right? There's many twists and turns, which many of you are familiar with, and a great many important and critical figures whose contribution can't be overlooked. Here at the Begin Center, of course, there's an obvious focus on Menachem Begin himself and also his inspiration and his teacher, Zev Jabotinsky. And certainly Jabotinsky saw himself as following in Herzl's footsteps. In fact, when he established his revisionist Zionist movement, when he left the mainstream Zionist committee, he did so because he felt that they had departed from Herzl's path of political Zionism, with its very explicit emphasis on Jewish independence, and he felt that there was a need to turn back to the true path as he saw it. As for Begin, he grew up in a very Zionist house with a father who hugely admired Herzl. There's actually a story of how Begin's father and a friend of his broke into the synagogue to, it was and as many were at the time, an anti-Zionist or certainly non-Zionist synagogue. And he and his friend broke in to organize a celebration for Herzl's birthday. Actually, his friend was Ariel Sharon's grandfather. It's not interesting, in fact. So I actually discovered just when, like literally last week when I was thinking about what I was going to say today, the very earliest piece of writing of Menachem Begin's that we have here at the center in our archive is an article written in 1931 in Yiddish. I'm not going to read it in Yiddish. For a one-off newspaper published by his father to mark Herzl's birthday. Begin would have been 18 years old when he wrote it. And its title in English is The Revolutionary. And he speaks there of the enormity of Herzl's achievement. He says, I'm just going to read a few lines, in front of the tormented Jewish soul that lived only with the present state of galut, of exile, Herzl, outlined a future free and full of light, a Jewish state. In front of the wandering and scattered people, he set before them a place of ingathering, of independence, in a land so closely connected to the very essence of the people, the land of Israel, a Jewish state where the language of the Bible is spoken. So Begin at 18. Now, for this event, the Begin Center are collaborating again with Gol Kalev, my friend, whose book Judaism 3.0 has inspired so many great conversations and debates about Zionism, Jewish identity, Israel's place in the Jewish world. And we've been very happy to host some of those conversations here. In fact, this is the fourth such event that we're doing. We have another one set for July the 9th, so you can get that in your calendars, where we'll be dealing with the not at all contentious issue of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. For tonight's event, Gal will be joined by two other wonderful Guest speakers, Avi Mayer, the brand new, just feet under the desk, editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, and Miss Ines Demiri, the Chargée d'Affaires of the Republic of Kosovo in Israel, an embassy proudly here in Jerusalem. And last but by no means least, we have once again fantastic moderator, Noa Amouyal, freelance journalist, media strategist at J-Cube Communications, a boutique PR firm in Tel Aviv. She's written for publications like the Jewish Chronicle, the Khaleej Times, and the Times of Israel. And prior to that, she was news editor for the Jerusalem Post. So I'm going to hand over to Noa and welcome our speakers.
Good evening, everyone. So it's great to be back at another Judaism 3.0 event at the Begin Center. Today we're marking, as Paul said, a very special occasion, Herzl's 163rd birthday. Happy birthday to Herzl. And he doesn't look a day over 150, I would say. So this evening we'll be speaking to Gol Kalev, the author of Judaism 3.0, and Avi Mayer, the Jerusalem Post new editor-in-chief. We are also very honored to have here with us Ines Demiri, Kosovo's envoy to Israel, again, as Paul mentioned. But first, a little word about Gol. Gol, as you know, is author of Judaism 3.0, Judaism's Transformation to Zionism. Gol lives and breathes everything Herzl. And I can't think of a better person to speak about him on his birthday. So Gol is a dear friend, both professionally and personally, and I've edited his articles back when I was news editor at the Jerusalem Post. And I can tell you that Gol always finds a way to work Herzl into every conversation. If you're sipping a glass of wine, Gol is going to talk to you about how drinking wine in Israel is the ultimate act of Zionism, and Herzl would be all for it. If you discuss the latest political turmoil unfolding here in Israel, he will talk about how Herzl mentioned something that happened in France in the late 1800s and how they both have similar views as to what's happening now and what happened in France over 100 years ago. So if Herzl was alive today, he'd either be very flattered or I think he would take a restraining order against Gol. So Gol is not just a thorough Herzl researcher, though. He has even traveled to places in Europe where Herzl wrote a particular diary entry so he could understand what Herzl was thinking and feeling and seeing at that very moment he wrote those words. Gol has revolutionized the field of Herzl research. He turned it in from something of a study that was antiquated and old to something that was modern, exciting, and maybe even a little bit sexy. His writings on Herzl have been featured in the Jerusalem Post, Newsweek, Foreign Policy, and the Jerusalem Report. And most recently, he has done so in a new video course he taught at the Brazil Jewish Academy called Applying Herzl. And we have good news for you tonight. That course will now be available free of charge. So call it a gift in honor of Herzl's birthday. All information pertaining to the course and the book, of course, can be found at judaism-zionism.com, mentioned right there, and I believe on a banner in Zoom as well. But we're here because of his book, Judaism 3.0, Judaism's Transformation to Zionism, which has ignited quite a conversation. In his book, Gol argues that Zionism has become an anchor to Judaism. He does so by analyzing long-term trends in Israel, diaspora Jewry, as well as global trends, and as to why Zionism is just as important to those who are supportive of Judaism as to those who are against it and against the state of Israel. Gol is able to do this because he is never just one thing. He's both secular and religious. He is someone equally happy to spend a night talking with intellectuals and historians about Israel, but also will immediately then go to the shuk and talk to tourists who've never been to Israel and just want a beer. Gol wants to see Israel from every angle imaginable, and I think Herzl would admire that. But Judaism 3.0 is becoming more than a book. Today, we're also inaugurating the Judaism 3.0 think tank. In 2011, when Gol was an investment banker in New York, he founded the American Israel Friendship League think tank, which served as a sounding board to his ideas that are now in his book that we see today. So in line with Herzl's vision, while those members are still in New York and around the world, the think tank is making aliyah and will now become the Judaism 3.0 think tank. So with that, I want to invite Gol up to the stage to tell us more about what that means and what Herzl would make as we celebrate his birthday today. Gol?
Well, hello, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and thank you, Noa, for this lovely introduction. Thank you, Avi. Looking forward to having a conversation with you as the new editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. And thank you, Ines. As Noa and Paul mentioned, Ines is the not just the first head of mission of Kosovo here in Israel. She's also the first head of mission of a European country here in Israel. And I think this is very significant historically and connects very well to Herzl and our topic today. Because what I'm saying in the book is that 2,000 years ago, both Jews and Judaism left Jerusalem. Jews came back. We're going to, in a few weeks, mark that occasion of Jews coming back to Jerusalem when we're going to celebrate Jerusalem Day. But I'm arguing in the book that so is Judaism, that now Judaism is coming back to Jerusalem, and more of Judaism is becoming anchored from Jerusalem, from Zion, from Zionism. And when we left Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, it wasn't of our own volition. It was because we were kicked out by invaders from Europe. First the Greeks, then the Romans. European opposition to Jerusalem has been a staple of history. And Herzl acknowledges that and understands that that's something that we just need to manage. So the idea that a European country now opens an embassy in Jerusalem is, I hope, serves as an inflection point in this European attitudes towards Jerusalem. So thank you, Ines. And thank you, Herzl, for starting that process that led to you opening your embassy here. Herzl, the story of Herzl is really a story of one man who changed the course of Jewish history, and in my view, also changed the course of humanity. And he did so basically on his own. He didn't say anything new. He didn't say anything that was shocking, like the idea of Jews returning to their ancestral homeland. Was a feature of Judaism, one of the main features of Judaism. It was supported by many people from the outside, at least in theory. But Herzl had a particular asset that maybe some of his predecessors did not, and that is that he was a complete outsider. Herzl was not a rabbi, and he was not a professor, and he was not a Jewish leader, and he was not part of a Jewish organization. He was pretty much outsider to the Jews. He didn't know much about what other Jews thought or wrote. That outside stature enabled him to see the reality in a different way. He had a different perception and a different, I'd say, depth of the same things that other people have saw that enabled the process that led us here today. And two of the things that he saw, two things that were sort of like core to his view, is that one is that the Judaism that he's in, what I call Judaism 2.0, the Judaism 1.0 being when we were here, Judaism 2.0 in the diaspora, that Judaism is not organic Judaism. That Judaism is primarily a function of European persecution. So yes, we go to synagogue and we pray and we're in the same family, but that's not, if you look at an individual, what defines you, where you live, where you work, what you do, what's your behavior, that was almost exclusively defined by the outside, by the persecution. So we were in England and we got deported from England. We were in France, we were deported from France. We were in Spain, we were deported from France. We were in Russia, we were deported to a particular area, the Pale of Settlements. So European persecution determines where the Jew lives. European persecution determines where the Jew works and what is the profession of the Jew. You can't just be a doctor or a lawyer or anything you want, and you're sort of forced into being a moneylender and professions like that. European persecution determines how many children Jews can have. Sometimes you're only allowed one in certain places. European persecution also determines where Jews can walk, travel, visit, what side of the streets they can walk on. And mostly European persecution determines Jewish behavior. So Judaism that he's born into, of those the 2,000 years of diaspora Judaism, is not the Judaism that is real Judaism. He compares it to a sea lion. A sea lion, in his analogy, is a lion, but he got thrown into the sea, and therefore he needs to adopt unnaturally certain behaviors. So he needs to develop fins to allow him to be in the sea. He's not a lion in the sea, but he's really a lion. So, so Herzl understand that Judaism is not, you cannot just, all those ideas that I mentioned that people say, oh yeah, we should go to Israel, we should come back to our ancestral homelands, are silly, and even calls them childish, because what are we going to do? I mean, we are defined by European persecution. If we're going to come to our promised land, our defining feature is going to be gone. Maybe we'll evaporate. Judaism needs to transform in order to survive. Judaism needs to replace the uniting feature of European persecution with something else, and that is Zionism. The second thing that Herzl identified is that others did not, and that it stunned people, is that everything I just said about European persecution and Jew hatred, these were not the primary malaise of the Jews, according to Herzl. The primary malaise and the primary problem of the Jews is the lack of united political leadership. There is no political structure of Jews. Over the years, there were sort of regional, the four-state council, regional councils of rabbis and things along those lines, but there's no sort of Jewish political structure. There's no head of Jews, there's no Jewish parliament or anything like that. So with that, answering those two issues, he creates the Zionist movement, creates Zionism, and he plants the seeds for the transformation of Judaism. Now, a lot of people till this day think, so mistake, Herzl's Zionism to be about Jews moving to Israel. And as I mentioned, Herzl is opposed to the idea of just immigrating to Israel without this infrastructure. He studies Moses and he learns from Moses. He does almost like case studies about Moses. And he understands, Herzl is the unexpected Torah interpreters. He understand that what Moses did was not, immigration of the Jews from Egypt to Canaan. The 40 years in the desert were a tool. It was what he called re-education through migration. Moses transformed the nation into what I call Judaism 1.0, and Herzl is going to transform the nation into what I call Judaism 3.0 with Zionism as its anchor. Judaism didn't end when the Hebrews arrived in Canaan. It actually just began. And same with Herzl's Zionism. It didn't end when the Jews arrived here. It's just Zionism is just beginning. Therefore, the term post-Zionism is intertwined with, if I may say, complete ignorance of Herzl's vision of Zionism. Because just like, if you say that our arrival here means post-Zionism, it's akin to saying that the Hebrews' arrival in Canaan means post-Judaism. Moses' Judaism only flourished centuries later. The temple was only built a few centuries after that. So Herzl plants the seed for the transformation of Judaism, and what I'm arguing in my book is that transformation is taking effect now at the 2020s. It didn't happen right away for various reasons, because transformation of this magnitude take a long time, but also there were insurmountable hurdles such as the Zionism association with secularism, not by Herzl's design, by development in the Zionist movements that followed, and various other issues, the perceptions of dual loyalty of American Jews if they were overemphasizing Zionism, the objections of the Haredis. All those hurdles I explain in the book are gone, and as I show, both Jews and non-Jews relate to Judaism primarily through the prism of Zionism now. The ideas that I present in the book are big ideas, are not our controversial ideas. I met with Natan Sharansky, who endorsed the book, and he said, look, you have about 50 or 60 very, very unique and provocative ideas that you kind of put together. I agree with the overall thesis that Zionism is becoming the anchor of Judaism, but you're not going to find one person that's going to agree with those 50 ideas one by one. He says, I know, and that's good that that's the case. And that's why we have the think tank that Noah mentioned, a group of people that can serve as a sounding board, and not just that, but deliberate the ideas, provide fresh perspectives. And that's what I did over 12 years ago when I was in New York. I was an investment banker, but I found out that a lot in my meetings with CEOs and boards of banks and financial institutions, a lot of people just want to talk about Israel and Zionism and Judaism. Maybe it's because of my investment banking skills, so I gathered some of those people and other people that I met along the way in New York, and we created a think tank that we housed in the America-Israel Friendship League called the AIFL think tank. On the board of the America-Israel Friendship League. Did that along with my dear friend, the late Ken Bayalkin. who headed the America-Israel Friendship League for many, many decades. As Noa said, now we're broadening the conversation. Now the book is out, and we've been getting a lot of reactions of all sorts and all sorts of flavors. And that's why the AIFL think tank is becoming the Judaism 3.0 think tank, so we can continue deliberating the ideas. And we already have done so, including here, as Paul mentioned, in the Begin Center. We had a conversation a few months ago about religiosity trends in Israel. I mentioned that one of the hurdles to Zionism becoming the hurdle of Judaism has been that Zionism has been associated with extreme secularism and rejection of religion. That, in my view, is no longer the case. There is both sort of a religious fashion amongst Israeli seculars while staying secular, and there's a sort of democratization, a shift of power and Zionist ethos from the secular minority to the traditional / religious majority in Israel. We've had the conversation a few weeks ago, or maybe a couple of months ago, about another aspect in the book. If I'm saying that Zionism is becoming the anchor of Judaism, it needs to be tested against global trends, and how is that walk around the world? We had a conversation about how this thesis fit with the debate between universalism and nationalism, with Dr. Anat Wilf and Deputy Mayor Flo Hassan Nahum. And we're having, as Paul mentioned, a discussion on July 9th about anti-Zionism as a vehicle of opposition to Judaism. So we've been having all those conversation. Today, we're going to tying it all to Herzl. Today's a special day. Today's the 10th of Iyar, the Hebrew calendar that started right now in sunset. The 10th of Iyar is Herzl's birthday. As Noa said, he's 163 years old. But there's another thing that happened here on this date, which occurred on Herzl's 36th birthday. Herzl starts this Zionism thinking around his 35th birthday at 1895. He publishes The Jewish State, the brochure, in February 14th, 1896. But then towards April, as his birthday approaches, he reaches a certain level of not frustration, but he understands that things need to move forward. He's an outsider, but he understands that in order for things to move forward, things needs to go through the elite, through the inside. And there is the global elite, the royalty of Europe, which he has no particular way of getting to. He has somebody knocks on his door, a British reverend that Herzl finds eccentric and says that he's the tutor of the children of one of the German royalty. And if Herzl pays for his travel expenses to Germany, he might be able to get a meeting. So Herzl, sort of skeptical, but does that. So he's nowhere in his mind as he approaches his 36th birthday vis-a-vis the European royalty, but he has a Jewish elite because there is no official Jewish political structure, but there's two people that are considered sort of like prominent Jews: the Baron Rothschild and the Baron Hirsch. Herzl writes the Jewish state sort of as a business plan, as a presentation to the Rothschilds, but a lot of his thinking that goes into it is triggered by a meeting he had with the Baron Hirsch, where the Baron Hirsch basically rejected all of his ideas. And Herzl sort of uses that as sort of like a negative muse, if there is such a thing, that kind of like wants to prove the Baron Hirsch and puts a lot of thought into that, puts the booklet, and he believes, because he identifies in the Baron Hirsch somebody who really, really wants to do good for the Jews, and he does, but he does it through philanthropy, which is in Herzl's the wrong way. So in many respects, he looks at the Jewish state as a way to convince the Baron Hirsch. The book has been out for 2 months as Herzl approaches his birthday, and is not sending it yet to him. He's getting ready to send it to him. He's strategized how he's going to send it, because all sort of like depends on that. He recruits Nodo, who is like his colleague and more of a celeb, to deliver the book to Hirsch, and he's ready to do that. And then as the book is on his way to Hirsch, Hirsch dies. And Herzl, if you read his diaries, Noah, I know that maybe I get overly emotional with Herzl, but it's very hard to read those lines in diaries. You sense maybe a sense of sadness, maybe desperation. He buys a ticket to go to Budapest from Vienna, which could be interpreted as sort of like a surrender. But then, just again, a few days, a week before his birthday, he gets this cable, this telegram for this reverend from Reverend Herzl, that English reverend, that Herzl did pay for his ticket. And he tells him, I think I have a good shot of getting a meeting with the Grand Duke of Baden, German royalty. And Herzl is like, still not sure. And then he sends another cable. And as Herzl is ready to go to Hungary and this is kind of to resign, he gets a telegram, come right away to Baden, I'm getting you a meeting. So Herzl cancels his trip to Budapest, gets on the train, goes to Baden in southern Germany to meet with the Grand Duke of Baden. And on Herzl's birthday, in maybe the first time in thousands of years, a Jewish leader that is perceived by the Duke to represent the Jews has a meeting with one of the leaders of the world, somebody who's not head of state, but part of the royal family of Germany. Herzl has this meeting, and he writes in his diaries something that's very telling. The Jewish people lost Hirsch today, and it's in the same day that I get audience with this royalty. A new book of Judaism began, a new book of the Jews began. Now he writes his diaries, so literally it means he's going to write a new book. But I think it also means that a new book for the Jews, a transition, if you will, from a Judaism that's based on philanthropy and sort of the idea of the exile of Judaism 2.0 to an ideas of the Zionism in the making of Herzl. So we have the book of Herzl, but we're not using his insight. As Noah alluded to, Herzl is mostly, for most people, is just, folklore, which is very, very important. Is a uniting figure. People sort of know about him. But at best, people know, basic research about him, and the researchers research him mostly from a biographical, some from a philosophical point of view. There's great, research coming out about Herzl, but still we don't use Herzl to apply his ideas and wisdom to today's issues. And my message that's part of this book, but also in my articles and in this Brazil Jewish Academy course that Noah mentioned, is that Herzl written so much, and he had some sort of wisdom that we can apply to our issues, not just to us, also around the world. I presented in a conference relating to European integration with the EU ambassador to Israel and other EU officials and EU scholars, European integration scholars, about how Herzl just is the visionary of the Jewish state. He can be the visionary of the European state. Because what Herzl did, if you read his writings very carefully, he understood the problems with the French liberal democracy, which was basically the only democracy in Europe at that time. He understood his flaws. He adopted stuff from the monarchy system, and he basically planted the seeds for a better European liberal democracy in Israel, in the Jewish state. And that's, in my view, to a lot of times, we tend to complain, and we have a lot of things in the news cycle. But if you look at Herzl's writings and compare it to what we have now, we didn't adopt Herzl's view one by one, but he has insight that can help the Europeans with the issue. Herzl was, understands the nationalism aspect of Europe because he was a German nationalist. Before German nationalism pivoted, he understands the idea of a multinational state because he was part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. He's Hungarian. The reason he was able to go to Vienna is because of this sort of what today would be akin to the EU. And the reason he joined the German nationalist fraternity is because Austrian nationalism was suppressed because it was, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire didn't reflect that. The prime minister of Austria was Polish. So he understands the nuances and the sentiments about that. And then he spent 4 years in France in the balcony of the French parliament and write very, very acute observations. So we have all of that, and we can use that. Herzl can also be of help to the Palestinians, to our Palestinian friends, because as I write in my articles and mentioned in the book and in my website, europeandjerusalem.com, I view Europe's treatment of the Palestinians as a reflection of European colonialism. There's basically the reduction of anything that's Palestinian to one narrative and one narrative only, which is the occupation. There's this no sort of neo-colonialist neo-religion called occupationalism. The joke in some of the Palestinian societies is that when you tell your friends your car didn't start this morning, you see a menacing shadow of an EU official that corrects you. No, your car did not start this morning because of the occupation. There is a dependency about, that Europe has, that the Palestinians have on the occupation, because that's the ethos that was forcing them from the outside. That's the budget of the Palestinian Authority. It's a very, somewhat akin situation to what Herzl is identifying with the Jews in Europe, that they are almost dependent on anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism made Jews of us. I'm not comparing, I'm not making any comparison other than to say that, the Palestinians can also benefit from Herzl's writing. Herzl's right that is essential to us, something that's very important to our endeavor as Jews to find, establish a Jewish state, is that we need some rest from Europe. We need 25 years where we hear nothing from Europe. It's because Europe is about wars and social complications. He even thinks about Argentina in part because he's nervous that if we'll be here in Palestine, we would be tempted to go back to Europe because it's so close. So just like, in Moses' case, when, they said that God, according to the Bible, what it says in the book of Exodus, did not send him to a particular way did not send the Hebrews out of Egypt in a particular way because he was nervous that once they see war, they want to come back to Egypt. So Herzl is worried about that too. Once we're going to have problems, and we did, he was correct. More than half of the second immigration that came here went back, the war problems. I think our Palestinian friends might also need some 25 years of break from Europe's, and what I call, what I often say is that Europe is the occupier of Palestine when it comes to their mind and their behavior. There's a lot of, which I'm not going to get into, but there's a lot of Herzl's insight when it comes to issues that we're dealing now with the legal reforms. Herzl writes a lot about the elite, about the balance of power, about many things that have to do with democracy, whether we need them, whether democracy is the best model, and we can apply that. I'm not saying that we should learn from Herzl and says, okay, Herzl said when we were children, we used to have a game, Herzl said. So we're not saying Herzl is not Moses, but we can use his wisdom and apply to our to our strategic issues today. Just like with Moses, we have yeshivas and university faculties and institutes that study the words of Moses. We have none with Herzl, and I think we should do that. And I have to say that over the last couple of years, there is this Herzlian awakening, both under official leadership in the World Zionist Organization under the chairman Yaakov Hagoel and others. They've been doing a lot of Herzl-related activities, including going to Basel and celebrating 125 years to the First Zionist Congress. Various writers. I partook in a book about Herzl Vision Today, and people that are writing about Herzl. So that's welcome, but I think we can take it to a much, much, much higher level. And we have also tools that we didn't have in the past, like artificial intelligence, because, Herzl, just reading Herzl is not sufficient to fully understanding him, because Herzl doesn't just write. He, first of all, writes in code. Dr. Yitzhak Weiss, perhaps, one of the most renowned Herzl researchers, points to Herzl asking us to read Herzl within the words, inside the words. But also Herzl writes a lot of short stories, a lot of philosophical stories. He writes plays, and they're all giving a message. Sometimes you need to write, even I, need to write a 4-page short story 5 or 6 times to understand what I think Herzl is saying and cross-reference it with, what he wrote, what other people wrote letters to him at this time. So there's a lot to learn about Herzl. I'll just give one quick example before, like Uganda. Look at Uganda. We all talk about, somebody asked me in the reception about Herzl in Uganda. The idea that towards his death, actually, there was a proposition that we will settle Jews in Africa, what became known as Uganda, the Uganda program. But if you read Herzl very carefully, and again, understand his nuances and sentences, and understand when he says this and that, and understand what he says when he comes to the rebels who said, no, we're not, we're only going to Zion. Uganda was not about settling Jews in Africa. That was part of it. That was a big part of it. Uganda was about engaging the British government. Because to a large extent, thanks to Uganda, we are here. Because what was Uganda? Uganda was a proposal by Chamberlain, the British colonialist minister, to settle Jews in Africa. It wasn't say, okay, tomorrow you go there. It says, let's establish a committee. The whole proposition, the whole debate was not about deciding to do it. It was deciding about establishing a joint committee between the Zionist institutions and the British government to examine this. And that was the whole, the people defected, people yes, no. Herzl eventually got it passed. But that created, first of all, an official recognition by a global power in Zionism, and in Zionism as the representative of the Jewish people. That is huge. That is by itself, you can say, Dayenu. This is what Uganda accomplished on day zero, before anybody even went to Uganda and this joint delegation. Uganda also engaged the British apparatus on its multiple levels, on the foreign ministry, on the colonialist office. It planted the ideas of Zionism that 10 years later, or 13 years later, came to fruition in the Balfour Declaration. And also Uganda, Herzl needed a lawyer, and he hired a lawyer by the name of David Lloyd George, who was the lawyer for the Zionist cause, and as it so happened, he later became prime minister, the prime minister that issued the Balfour Declaration. So Uganda is just one example of, if we can dive into the depth of Herzl thinking and philosophy, we can apply it to a lot of our strategic issues today, in this constant news cycle and soundbite world. And I think we should do that. And the think tank hopefully can help doing that, and hopefully I can help do that in the book. So I will conclude with the way that Herzl concluded. Herzl, I said, was an outsider, started his Zionist journey in 1895 and ended it in 1904 prematurely when he died. And before he died, he wrote one more article called Journey's Blessing, an article that's directed to all of us, very similar to Moshe, to Moses. Moses wrote towards the end of the Torah, of the fifth book of the Torah in the Bible, what's we call in Hebrew Shirat HaAzinu, Moses' song, which is not about, hey, I'm about to die and you're just going to go to Canaan, good luck. It's about a template to succeed in centuries to come. You're going to go astray, and this is how you're going to go back. It's very difficult to understand Moses' words, but it was a recognition that this is not a migration into Canaan. This is a transformation of the Hebrew nation into what I call Judaism 1.0. And here is in this song, Zinu, a template to keep it once you get in. And Herzl, I think, did a similar thing in Journey's Blessing. Also, if you read between the lines, he explained to us that Zionism is an infinite ideal. And it is not just about the aspiration to the coming back to the land of the Jews. And he reminds us that once we're here, that's Zionism just begins. Zionism is not just the aspiration to come here, it's the aspiration for moral and spiritual completion, he tells us. And that's something that's very important. He directs it, the article, to third grade student. Herzl loved a play on words, to punt. And it's not exactly like today's third grade, but these are people that were roughly the age of Ben Gurion, roughly the age of Jabotinsky, Begin's mentor. And that's and he tells them and tells us in this article, Journey's Blessing, this is the time of the triaries. The triaries, and there was an expression at that time that was used, the triaries are the third level of the Roman Empire's military that comes to kind of finish the job, to decide the battle. In the Roman military doctrine, you have three levels. You have the first level that engages the enemy. Second level that maybe does some more fighting. But the battle is decided by the third level. That's why it's called triaries. And Herzl tells us, when it comes to Judaism, now it's the time of the triaries, or in my words, it's the time for Judaism 3.0. Thank you.
Thank you, Gol. Coming up next, we'd love to hear from Ines Demiri. She is the first Kosovo chargé d'affaires in Israel. Kosovo and Israel has established diplomatic relations in 2021. When they did that, Kosovo decided to open its embassy right here in Jerusalem. And as we mentioned before, Kosovo is the first European country to open their embassy here in Jerusalem. And it's also the first country with a Muslim majority to open its embassy in Jerusalem. So we're happy to have her here today. She is a career diplomat in the Kosovo Foreign Service. And I think it is fair to say that we're all pleased that she's nominated to be the head of the Kosovo embassy here in Israel. So thank you very much. Ines, we would love to hear from you.
First of all, thank you, Noah, for the introduction. Good evening, Erev Tov. It's really an honor to be here at the Begin Center. That celebrates an institution that celebrates the legacy of one of the great leaders of the Jewish nation. And also, it's a great honor to be here to celebrate the legacy of one of the towering figure of the human history, Theodor Herzl. And that's a great pleasure and honor to be here to celebrate Gol Kalev's groundbreaking book, Judaism 3.0. And as my very dear friend, because I had the chance to make many friends, especially in Jerusalem, the deputy mayor of Jerusalem, where Hassan Naum said, Kalev picks up where Herzl left off. Thank you, dear God. Thank you for this opportunity. You remain to be on the top list of loyal friends of the Kosovo's embassy here in Jerusalem. I want to begin just to say a few words about my country, the Republic of Kosovo, and for the strong, enduring relationship that we have with the state of Israel and its Jewish people. I'm not so sure how much you are familiar with the Jewish history in Kosovo, but the existence of the Jews in Kosovo is dating back from the 15th century. They came during the Inquisition period from Spain and Portugal, living there, which at that time Kosovo was not Kosovo, but there were the territories of Kosovo. They built their synagogues, they had their own yeshiva, their Jewish municipality, they were active members of the society. And besides the languages of the countries that they came from, they also learned to speak the Albanian, Turkish, and Serbian languages. We see in Kosovo our relations with Israel in two dimensions. The first dimension is the time of Holocaust, and during this time, Kosovo became a transition road, which in Kosovo there were more than 3,000 Jews living there. It became a transition road for the Jews for escaping to Albania, which was the safest heaven, the safest country. I'm sure you are very familiar with the story of Albania and Albanians saving the Jews during that period of time. And we had many Kosovar Albanians that gave to the Jews a safe transfer to Albania. And some of them, we are very proud that they are listed in the righteous among the nations, in the list of the righteous among the nations in Yad Vashem. But in Kosovo, we unfortunately had the time of deportation. There was around 200 Jews that they were deported to the concentration camp Bergen-Belsen. And if I may share with you a story, a personal story about the deportation to Bergen-Belsen, were family members also of my father. And my grandmother at the time, that was 17, 18 years old, she was mobilized by the rabbi of Pristina at the time, Yosef Levi, and she joined the partisans to fight against fascism. And at some point, her life also was saved by my Albanian grandfather, who eventually got married with her. So I can proudly say that I am the granddaughter of both Albanian and Jewish ancient people. And the second dimension of our relations with Israel, with the Jewish people, was at the time on 1999 when we had the war inside our country. The first to stand up and speak to stop the ethnic cleansing that is happening in Kosovo were the Jewish people in Israel all around the world, in Europe, in US, and everywhere. And we are deeply thankful for their advocacy. And for the state of Israel as well, for hosting at the time 200 Kosovo refugees. Working for the MFA for a decade, and especially on the relations between Kosovo and Israel. 2 years ago, I had the honor and the privilege, an honor that was given by my country to open the embassy here in Jerusalem. And this will remain forever as the most precious emblem that I will carry on my heart. After opening the embassy under very difficult, very challenging circumstances, I had to establish an embassy from scratch, but I had to run to fill the gap of the many years that we didn't have diplomatic relations with Israel. But I'm very proud, and I see every day the interest of the Israeli people to connect with Kosovo, to work with Kosovo. And so far, we had a lot of official visits. We had a lot of agreements signed in science education, in field co-production, even with Yad Vashem. And we have IT companies, or IT cooperation is growing each day more and more. Innovations that are produced in Jerusalem, but throughout Israel, are impacting the lives of so many around the world. And we in Kosovo, we are aware of that and benefit from the fulfillment of Herzl's vision. We trade with Israeli companies, and so far we have 14 Israeli companies operating in Kosovo. My country is a very small country. It's a half size of the state of Israel with 2 million inhabitants. And we just celebrated our 15 years of independence, but we have a lot of similarities with the state of Israel in many aspects. And I always say there's no country in the world that can better understand Kosovo and the challenges of building a country from scratch than Israel. Kosovo is a country where you have people from different religions and different ethnicities. Based on our constitution, we are a secular country, but we have a law that recognizes 5 traditional religions in Kosovo, including Judaism. So Gol, that is a perfect country for the promotion of your new book. When I came to Jerusalem to open the Kosovo's embassy just 2 years ago, I arrived in a Jerusalem that is relatively safe, prospering, clean, and beautiful. But also I was raised in a city in Kosovo, which is very similar to Jerusalem. And I want to give you the example of why. Because in a very center of the city, in 15 minutes walking distance, the city starts with a mosque, very old mosque. Then you have an Orthodox school for Pope. And then it continues with a very old, again, Orthodox, a very old mosque. Then it continues with an Orthodox church, then a Catholic church. And soon Kosovo will be my city, my hometown will be home to a Jewish cultural center and synagogue. And this is the mosaic and the beauty of my country. So 120 years later, I think Herzl will be very proud that his vision came true. Herzl, as Gol described in his book, planted the seed of the transformation of the Jewish nation. Menahem Begin, along with other leaders of his generation, executed that vision and built the country. And we, not just you in Israel, but also we in Europe and all over the world, we are benefiting of all of this. And this is how Gol said again on his book, it's a global interest. So I want to thank you, Gol, for your groundbreaking book. And I want to thank the Begin Center for hosting this event and celebrating the life of Menahem Begin. And I want to thank Herzl for dreaming and for leading the process that got us all here. His dream made possible our dreams as well, to reconnect with our very old friends, but this time in Israel with a new chapter of cooperations. Toda Rabba.
Thank you, Ines. That was lovely. The next portion of the evening will be a discussion between Gol Kalev and Avi Mayer that I'll be moderating. Avi Mayer is a man of many accomplishments, a former spokesperson for Natan Sharansky while at the Jewish Agency, the managing director of public affairs at the American Jewish Committee, and now editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. Not an easy gig. He also makes very good homemade challahs, I have to say. So, oh, and how can I forget? He has almost 150,000 followers on Twitter. Yeah. So this is one of Avi's first public appearances since he's become editor, and we are delighted to have him here today. Avi, we would love to have you up on the stage, and Gol, of course, too. How about now? Good? You can hear me? So, Avi, let's start off with you. You and Herzl actually have something in common. And, oh, you can't hear me?
Do you want to take mine?
Now? Yeah? Sorry about that. So, Avi, you and Herzl actually have something in common, and Gol might even be jealous, because you and... Still nothing? Can you guys hear me now? Sorry about that. Anyway, let's start again. So you and Herzl actually have something in common. Gol might even be a little bit jealous because you guys might have this bromance that you and Herzl were both journalists and editors of a paper. Sorry, Gol is also a journalist. Oh my God. That's true. That's true. My bad. So you're both editors of a paper. So speaking to that, what is your perspective on journalism today and being in charge of a paper today? How is social media changing that landscape? And with the turmoil in Israel being so hot right now, this is certainly a time to be editor of a paper. So how are you seeing everything in this new role?
Thank you, Noah. Thank you, Gol. Thank you, dear Ines. Thank you to everyone who's here today and online as well for joining us and celebrating Herzl's special birthday. I can't say that I speak from a great deal of experience. I've been on the job for all of 5 weeks. But I think that this is a particularly fascinating time to be in this world of journalism. I think it is undergoing an interesting transformation, just as Gol has suggested that Judaism is transforming. I believe that journalism is transforming as well. I think there's much more of an emphasis on opinion journalism, which I would say actually often delves into the realm of advocacy rather than strict journalism and strict news reporting. And I have to say, I'm something of a purist. I think journalism and journalists should report the facts as they are, devoid of bias. Thank you. And that includes the good, the bad, and the ugly. There's a great deal of good in this country. There's some bad, and there's even a little bit of ugly. And I think that it's important for us as journalists to report all of it. And ultimately, I think that that's what will gain us the greatest credibility. I was talking to a senior Israeli official a couple of weeks ago, and he said to me, sort of provocatively, he didn't actually believe what he was saying, but he sort of wanted to challenge me. And he said, do you feel that showing all the complexity of Israel could actually undermine Israel's story or Israel's efforts to tell its story to the world? And I said, absolutely not. I said, if we are seen as serious, if we are seen as credible, because we show all the elements of what make up this special mosaic that is Israel, that ultimately will be the greatest sign of our credibility and will gain us the greatest seriousness in the eyes of those who are reading our content around the world. That said, I do think it's appropriate for journalists and for journalistic endeavors and for newspapers and media outlets to have a mission statement. It's important to realize that the Jerusalem Post was created 90 years ago to tell the story of the Jewish community in Palestine. That's why Gershon Agronsky, Agron, as he later Hebraicized his name, founded the Jerusalem Post, at that time the Palestine Post, because he felt that the story of the Jews in Palestine was not being sufficiently told to the British Mandate authorities and to the world. And that has remained our mission to the present day, telling Israel's story to the world and all of its complexity. And when I took on this role just a few weeks ago, and I had to think about what I was going to write for my first column, I decided that I wanted to focus on what our values are as a newspaper, because I think it's important that papers have values, that they actually stand for something. And the first thing I said is, we are a Zionist newspaper. I think that's the first time that statement had ever actually been made. It was sort of implied in the sort of content that we produced and the sort of perspectives we take on the issues. But it was important for me to say so outright, because it means that we will not stand for assaults on Israel's right to exist. We will not stand for those who denigrate the very right of Jews to have self-determination in the land of Israel. And we will stand up for the realization of that right in the state of Israel. It was also important for me to say that we are a pro-democracy paper, and we will stand against efforts to undermine the principles of democracy that are enshrined in Israel's Declaration of Independence. We're an anti-racist paper. We will not tolerate anti-Semitism in any of its forms, including, of course, anti-Zionism, a little promo for your July 9th event, or bigotry targeting any other group, including Israel's minorities. And I think that within the boundaries of those principles, there's a great deal of room. There's a lot of space for debate. A paper that can accommodate on Wednesday an argument by one columnist that Israel is persecuting Palestinians and that's a stain on the Jewish conscience, and 2 days later on Friday, an argument by another columnist that Hamas is in cahoots with the Israeli left and is taking cues from the protest movement in Israel, that's a paper I want to be in, because it shows the diversity of views and the ability to really have a breadth of a conversation I think is really unmatched anywhere else in the media landscape.
And Gol, you've contributed to the Jerusalem Post many times, of course, and your opinions and your pieces tend to, they have a strong opinion usually. So what do you have to say to what Avi contributed? Do you agree with that perspective? And where do you draw the line between you trying to formulate opinion, but you also trying to be a little bit objective when it comes to Herzl, who you adore so very much?
First now.
Okay, so first of all, what do I think about what Avi said? Well, Avi is sort of my boss now, so of course he's right in everything he said. And I'm a freelance journalist, so he can, he can just reject all my articles if he wants to.
Be careful, Gol.
I think, look, I mean, I don't envy you. It's a very interesting position and very difficult position to be an editor-in-chief, dealing with all the tensions you've just mentioned to begin with. But because of what you identified as a shifting landscape of journalism, is it opinion, is it facts, what is it, what is facts? Then you have another derivative sort of making decisions about, how opinion we are in general, or what, so it's and it counts because, I wrote for the Jerusalem Post, I got to cover, if you remember, Noah, the 2016 Republican primaries in some of the early states like South Carolina and Nevada. I sent articles to Noah, and I really tried to put Herzl into Ted Cruz's and Marco Rubio's speeches, but she took it out as the editor. But when I would talk to people and just say I'm from the Jerusalem Post, people would have tears and would view, like, if you're from the Jerusalem Post as an ambassador, of Israel, like you speak for Israel. And one of your predecessors, Steve Lindy, I remember that he told me about a conversation he had with then Vice President Joe Biden, that he felt like he's really Joe Biden is giving him talking points and explaining to him how much he loves Israel and how important Israel is. So you're not just, whether you like it or not, you're sort of like representing Israel, which is, seems like a contradictory to your role of being a neutral journalism. So I don't, in my personal view, and again, I'm a freelance journalist. It's not the only thing that, I'm a writer. I research Herzl. I disclose that I think anything that I write, and in my view, anything that anybody writes is opinion, or at least has an opinion component in it. You can write the weather is great. It's like the weather in Jerusalem today. You can say it's global warming and therefore it's colder, therefore it's hotter. You can say it's great. You can always find your comparable benchmark. And that is a challenge. Now, Herzl, it's very interesting because he viewed sort of the role of the press as part of the fabric of the power structure in France. I don't think there was, he, I think, wrote, I read, a lot of his articles that he wrote when he was sort of like bureau chief of the New York Press. It was sort of the birth of like sort of the equivalent of the New York Times, the most one of the most prominent liberal newspapers in Europe at that time. For 4 years, the newspaper was in Vienna. He was the Paris correspondent, and it seemed to me that he was writing sort of like reporting what's happening in French politics objectively. But then, you know, after a few more years of Herzl research, I found out that he was under investigation by the French government, by the French, you know, sort of FBI, for being anti-French, for his articles being anti-French, because he was skeptic about the French democracy, was skeptic about the political structure of give and take. He understood that corruption is a prerequisite for governance in a democracy. He preferred the corruption of a bribe, because if somebody gives a politician a bribe, then there's one transaction that's been done that's not in the interest of the people. But he was talking about the more common corruption that's legal, supposedly, where you said, okay, I'll vote for the law that you want to make, and you'll you know, promote my nephew to be the head of the legion, or doing like one level below. The give and take that are, you know, in a coalition type government are necessary. And to him, that was worse corruption, because you have two transactions that are being done. So that's just one example. He was he was viewed, even though it seems neutral, as not a neutral journalist. And soon thereafter, after his time, the French press was part of the division that occurred in France between the, you know, pro-Dreyfus and anti-Dreyfus. It didn't really matter about, you know, was Dreyfus guilty or not. It became a referendum about Jews in France. So it's interesting. And on the other hand, Clemens, you know, after Herzl died, there's somebody came to interview Georges Clemenceau, who was the French president during World War I, but knew Herzl during Herzl's time there. And he started asking him questions about Herzl, and Clemenceau basically sort of like yells about him, about what happened to journalism. Journalists used to have an opinion, and now you're all kind of hedgy. What do you think? It's like, what do you think as a journalist? So Herzl, even in Herzl's time, there was sort of, you know, I think the press seemed to be more partisan. He was offered to be an editor-in-chief. You know, he was a bureau chief of that newspaper in Paris, and then he was an editor of essays, sort of like opinion editor, when he came back to Vienna. But he was offered to be your colleague, an editor-in-chief of a newspaper that will speak the voice of the government. And that was a very normal thing. This was like an official, like in Israel, people accuse Israel Hayom, you know, like this was an official thing. This is the voice of the government. But he preferred to be the editor-in-chief of another newspaper that speak the voice of another government, of the Zionist government in the making, if you will, of the Welt. He established a newspaper, the Welt, as a way of spreading his Zionist message. So press was certainly much more partisan at his time.
Am I allowed to pose a question? Am I allowed to do that?
This is a conversation.
Yeah, I'm relishing this new role as a journalist. Do you think that Herzl stayed a journalist? Meaning, once he became the sort of progenitor of the Zionist idea and he started advocating for it around the world and with royalty and so on and so forth, do you think he still considered himself to be a journalist? Do you think he was viewed by others as a journalist as he was also adopting this role as king of the Jews?
I think, first of all, he understood what I think certainly me and others kind of view as, like, there is no kind of, I'm a journalist, I'm a banker, you know, I'm an influencer, I'm a spokesperson, I'm a this, I'm a that, you know, like Noah and you and me, like we had different roles in different parts of our lives, and so did Herzl. So he wasn't, you know, his identity, it wasn't like the journalist identity that some of my journalist friends have. It's sort of like a club. But he connected those two, and I'm a little bit nervous because I'm hoping nobody is listening from the Israeli prosecutor's office so they don't indict Herzl. But he basically used his press card to promote his interest. And he said that. And his interest was the promotion of Zionism. And everybody else did it. That was, you know, there was a partisan type. So he gets meetings with the Sultan. He gets meetings, maybe with this meeting I just mentioned earlier with the Grand Duke of Baden. Maybe that had something to do with it. He discloses when he meets with Hirsch, look, I want to meet with you. You're an important Jewish leader. It's not about a journalistic interview. But did he meet him? I mean, so he understood that the power that he has is through his press card, and that's why it's a fascinating balance of power that he has between upsetting his supervisor. He goes out on Zionism. So you ask, has he been a journalist? If he was supposed to be a journalist and loyal to his employer, the new Freie Presse, he should have, continued with the messages that they're trying to promote. But he broke away from that into promoting the idea of Jewish nationalism, upset at his supervising editors, and he knew that any day he can get fired. And if he gets fired, he loses Zionism because he loses his press card. So it's a very, very interesting balance.
And I think if I might add, I think you'll find that once you have the power of the pen in your hand, you don't want to relinquish it. I'm sure Gol agrees with that as well. So let's talk a little bit about social media. As I mentioned, you have almost 150,000 Twitter followers. How does social media impact journalism today when everything is so dynamic? It's very easy for people to have a knee-jerk reaction. What does that do to the newsroom? I of course saw glimpses of it myself. And what do you think, what kind of social media influencer do you think Herzl would be today?
Look, I think it's without a doubt, it has influenced journalism. I think there's a greater sense of immediacy than there ever was before. The fact that anyone with a smartphone becomes a citizen journalist, I think, is a transformation of sorts when it comes to journalism. That said, I think there is a qualitative difference to having an established news organization behind you that simply cannot be matched no matter how many Twitter followers you may have. And I have, as you said, no shortage of them. I think that at the end of the day, that does still carry significant weight. And Avi Mayer, the random guy who has X number of Twitter followers, is not the same as Avi Mayer who's speaking on behalf of the Jerusalem Post. And I will say that I choose my words more carefully now than I did previously, because I recognize that there is a significant and a major journalistic endeavor behind me that I represent, whether I want to or not, whether my Twitter persona is representative of my professional stature or not. And I think that is something that we all need to bear in mind. I think that there are some journalists who are not always cognizant of that reality, and sometimes engage in rhetoric that I would view as damaging and unhealthy to their journalistic roles. And I think that ultimately that is a responsibility that we bear. Any of us who engage in the global conversation online should realize that there's a global audience that is watching what is being said. And to the extent that we do represent news organizations that need to be taken seriously and need to have their credibility maintained, that is something that we also need to have in mind.
Yeah, I think Herzl actually has a lot to say about social media, because social media is a reflection of the populace, as you said, anybody with a smartphone. Herzl's study, what we call today populism, I think uses the word populace, the masses. He observed very carefully how you can control the masses. In Hebrew, there's a singer, Meir Ariel, that he says, Am af pam lo sholet, am tamid nishlat. The people, the power of the people, there's no such thing power of the people. The people are being empowered, are being powered over. And democracy, no democracy, Herzl writes and observes how people are being controlled by all sorts of messages, by all sorts of ways. And he observes the early stages of what later became the pivoting of the German nationalist movement. Also in France, the pivoting of the French populists against Dreyfus, and then as a force that became later to enable and support the Holocaust in France. Herzl studies Bismarck very careful. Bismarck is sort of the father of Germany, the Herzl of Germany, if you will, the first chancellor. And he understands what he did. Bismarck, just like Herzl, did not invent anything new. That's what Herzl says. He has everything on the tree. Bismarck understood the masses, the populace, the sentiments. And all he did, according to Herzl, all that Bismarck did is shake the tree under which all of those things were planted on. He knew how to shake it. He knew how to, in a sense, control, the masses, control social media, if you will, to use today's terminologies. And I think Herzl, tried to do that too. He didn't invent anything. He just shook the tree in a very effective way.
Look, I actually think, in answer to the second part of your question, I think Herzl would be a Twitter provocateur, because in his earlier years, at the early years of Zionism, it was not very popular. In fact, it was very much countercultural. It ran against the grain of even where European Jews were at. I think he might have even been considered something of a troll in his earlier years. Obviously, in time, it caught on to the point where today it is the dominant ideology in the Jewish world. But I'm not sure we would have enjoyed his company in his earlier years on Twitter. And it would be interesting to sort of see how that evolved if he had that medium at that time, if he sort of took on that more serious role, that gravitas of being truly representative of where the Jewish people were at that time.
Yeah, Herzl probably would have been blocked by many people, including many, many Jews.
So let's talk about Hasbara. We're in 2023 and Israel still hasn't really been able to figure it out. What is your perspective on it? Are we getting better at telling Israel's story as one of Israel's biggest storytellers today? And now you have an official platform. What are we doing right and what are we doing wrong? And do you see that we're getting better at it? And same question to Gol.
I think that, look, I have a different hat on today than I did 5 weeks ago. But I think that ultimately my goal is the same, which is to tell the story of this country in all its complexity. I've never been one to gloss over the warts of this country, and there are a few warts. And I think that ultimately anyone who takes seriously the role of telling the story of this country needs to engage in those aspects of its society and its life as well. Anyone who tells you, who gives you this sanitized version, this Disneyland perspective on Israel, quite frankly, is doing no one any service at all, because it takes very little more than a Google search to scrape off that varnish and see the truth that lies underneath, which is a complex one, but ultimately a beautiful one. And ultimately, I believe Israel has a compelling story to tell. And I think that once we tell that story in all its complexity, that is ultimately what will be the strongest argument that Israel possibly could have. And that is ultimately what I think my role is at the Jerusalem Post. Telling the story of Israel in all its complexity, presenting the vast range of views that exist within Israeli society, which really run the gamut, some of which I find detestable, others of which I may agree with more. But they are the true representation of where the conversation is at in this country. I think to exclude any part of that conversation would be to do not only my paper, but really my audience a disservice. And ultimately, I think that telling the complexity, telling the richness of that conversation will be the strongest advocacy that we could possibly do for this country and for its role in the world.
Gol, do you think Herzl would be good at Hasbara?
No, because Herzl did not believe in Hasbara. Herzl, which I think is very relevant to today, thought that Hasbara is futile because he concluded that dogmatic minds cannot be changed. And certainly when it came to people's views against or on the Jews, you could not change dogmatic minds. So I appreciate what you said and what all the wonderful people who are, Michael Oren and others who are on CNN and promoting Israel. If we deploy Herzl's thinking, he would say, it's important maybe, but it doesn't move the needle, because at his time, Hasbara was done to what was known as committees against anti-Semitism. And everybody was like, wonderful, there's this committee against anti-Semitism and that committee against anti-Semitism. There's like another 20 committees founded in the city. Like Herzl said, this is, I don't want to say this thing, this word, but this is not something that's very productive, or there's not, and what's needed is a paradigm shift. What's needed is not to convince people, because we won't be able to. What you need is a paradigm shift, and that is a Jewish state. Because once you have the Jewish state, you do two things. One is that you have sort of like a better relationship to handle this conflict, this European Jewish conflict, if you will. But the other is what Avi was just talking about, I think, is that the Jewish state will produce innovations that are unimaginable. The Jewish state will advance humanity. And therefore, the Jewish state will become a necessity of the world. So if we have a Jewish state, the people that are against us, they might not like us, but this will be what we call today peace through strength. You will need the Jewish state, and therefore, the Jewish state will exist. I apply this to my views in Judaism 3.0, because again, I think that, again, a promo to the July 9th event, Paul, that we're going to do here, is about anti-Zionism. It's anti-Zionism, what I call in the book Israel bashing, is an existential threat to Judaism. And I draw in the book parallels between that and the early stages of the anti-Semitism movement in Herzl's time. There's a lot of similarities, and it grows very fast. And here too, I don't think Haspara, works. I mean, my journalist friends are convinced, for example, that Israel made a decision to assassinate the Al Jazeera journalist in that tragic, horrible thing. I cannot convince them that I don't think that's the case. I have other friends. I have a friend in France who's convinced that Israeli soldiers go into Palestinian towns and villages and sexually assault and rape women. And that was like years ago when she told me that. And then she points, now the Amnesty report and others sort of like, support notions that that Israel commits crimes against humanity and does horrible things there. So, I cannot convince people. So what we need today, again, is a paradigm shift, and that is what Judaism 3.0 is. Because once you accept that Zionism is the anchor of Judaism, you cannot hide behind this notion that you love the Jews and you hate the Zionists. The Jew hater has to stay in Judaism 2.0. If we have a global recognition that we're in Judaism 3.0 and Zionism is organizing principle, then it mitigates the opposition and the existential threat to Judaism through Zionism. And we have an asset today that we didn't have in Herzl's time, and that is that saying that you hate Jews is not popular. Back then, being an anti-Semite and saying you hate Jews was okay. Now it's politically incorrect. It can end your career. But saying that you hate the Zionists can help your career. So once we create that equation, once we are in Judaism 3.0 and there's a broad global recognition that we're during those events, and maybe you're all ambassadors of that message, that Zionism is the anchor of Judaism, then Israel bashing and Jew bashing has become one and the same.
I spent 7.5 years working for Natan Sharansky, and he, of course, came up with the 3Ds, the way to sort of distinguish legitimate criticism of Israel from that criticism which delves into anti-Semitism, which, of course, are delegitimization, demonization, and double standards. But he also talks about how he actually defines two pillars for modern Judaism. One is a connection to Israel, and the other is religion. And he said that if you have one of those, you're probably going to be okay. If you have both, fantastic. But if you have neither, it is unlikely that your Judaism is sustainable. And I think that it is very true. And what you said is true as well, meaning anti-Zionism is, to my mind, invariably anti-Semitic. I have yet to encounter a form of contemporary anti-Zionism today, which is not anti-Semitic, at least in effect. Right? So if you are denying only the Jewish people a right that you believe all other nations in the world have, that is discrimination against Jews. And that is the textbook definition of anti-Semitism. It's undeniable. That's not something you can get around. And I have engaged many of the leading thinkers, the luminaries of the anti-Zionist movement on this, and they have no compelling response to that. I think that's a point that is very well taken and one that we need to internalize, and we certainly will internalize at the Jerusalem Post. We will not harbor any sentiment that suggests that Jews do not have right to self-determination or that Zionism is somehow illegitimate. That is something that we will absolutely be standing against so long as I'm editor.
You also, before you took on the role of editor-in-chief, you worked at the AJC, being the chief spokesperson, storyteller at the organization, and had a lot of time with donors, with lay leaders in the Jewish community. What do you think they would think of this notion that Zionism is the organizing principle of Judaism? Is this something that you think would be accepted amongst millennial Jews, maybe even Gen Z Jews?
Look, the proof is in the pudding, meaning the more a young person has exposure to an engagement with Israel, the more likely he or she is to have a Jewishly meaningful life, to engage in Jewish practice, to marry Jewish, to have Jewish children, to send them to Jewish schools, to engage in Jewish synagogues and communities, and so on and so forth. That's undeniable. The research shows that that's the case. Whether they believe it or not is somewhat immaterial, because at the end of the day, that is the reality. The truth of the matter is that large numbers of donors, philanthropists, Jewish professionals acknowledge that this is the case, which is why there's so much encouragement of engagement with Israel, which is why The notion of travel to Israel and Israel experiences is really catching on in a big way, because they know that this is one of the greatest guarantors of Jewish continuity, a connection to Israel. Of course, religion is another, and that is certainly something that we cannot discount, and I certainly believe in as well. But even if you don't associate with Jewish religion, even if you don't believe that that is something that adds meaning to your life, if you have a connection to Israel, the likelihood that you will have Jewishly significant life and continue to have, that you will continue the Jewish chain is much higher than if you do not. And I think that's something that many people recognize, and that is certainly reflected in the philanthropic priorities of many philanthropists in the Jewish world.
Yeah, I was going to just ask you, I was going to make the question more applicable to your experience. So you often host people from out of town, of all across America, Christian, Jews, etc. Do they, when you give them the whole spiel about Judaism, Zionism being the organizing principle of Judaism, what is their impression of that?
Because some of those people are avid critics of Israel. Some of them are pro-Palestinians who are, I cannot, trying to convince about particular policies. They're not Israel bashers. They might be Zionists, but they're not happy with our policies. But they too connect to their Judaism if they're Jewish through Israel. And if they're not, because I'm saying in the book that the connection to Judaism through Zionism is both in the positive and the negative. The most American Jews that I know, I mean, there are people who, as you said in the Natan Sharansky, in the framework you mentioned, who are religious, and that's great. But that's, maybe 10% of American Jews. Most Jewish peoples are not connected to religion, but they connect to Israel, and many of them to the negative. Like they don't think about Judaism unless they read an article in the New York Times or someplace and write a Facebook or a Twitter, as a Jew, I'm embarrassed. Or they're coming to the Judaism to the negative. So when I host those people, and they're here, and I ask them, they engage. If you have to map out your Jewish related experiences in a given week, the vast majority of them will be through Israel, because a lot of them are, through being upset about Israel, but others might be because you're watching fauda or drinking Israeli wine, as we just did. There's this synagogue in Chicago that declared that anti-Zionism is a core value of them. And that sort of proves, or is one of the proof for my theory, because here is a Reform synagogue, with people that, don't go to synagogue, that, don't do anything Jewish. And Zionism did something that's remarkable. It brought Jews into synagogue. It brought Jews back into Judaism. In this case, through the negative, to come and deliberate and pass a resolution, another resolution. So Zionism brought them back into the Judaism, exactly as Herzl envisioned, that Zionism is the vehicle to come back to Judaism, in this case in the negative. And who knows, maybe while they're in synagogue condemning Israel, in Zionism, they'll see a pamphlet or something, and you go to a Jewish religious lecture, go to a service or something like that.
Well, I would like to conclude by asking about Yom Ha'atzmaut. We just celebrated 75 years. It's a big milestone. Where are we today? Where's the country at today? And what do you think Herzl would make of Israel at 75?
My predecessor, Yaakov Katz, wrote a very moving final column as editor of the Jerusalem Post. And he wrote that the protests that we're seeing now for the 17th week running actually signify the end of post-Zionism, the death of post-Zionism. Because if we thought that here these Tel Aviv residents couldn't care less about what happens in Israel, they're all just taking out second passports and moving to Berlin, here we see that every Saturday night, hundreds of thousands of Israelis on both sides of the debate are flooding into the streets, waving Israeli flags and calling for a better future. That is, I think, remarkable. And it doesn't matter where you stand on this debate. You could be pro the reform or anti the reform. You can be pro the prime minister or anti the prime minister. The fact that you are fighting for the future of this country is, I believe, a modern form of Zionism. And I think Herzl would be very proud.
Absolutely. We like to complain here, but I mean, what we have accomplished here in 75 years is absolutely remarkable. And Herzl, if he looks down at us at his 163rd birthday, I think will be very, very proud of what we accomplished, and very proud of the notion that we were only getting started. We're only getting started with understanding Herzl, and we're certainly only getting started with the Zionist story.
Thank you, everyone. I know we don't have a lot of time, but if we could take a couple questions from the audience, that would be great. I don't know if we're... Yeah, am I supposed to give the mic to someone? That gentleman in the green sweater right in front of me. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, sir.
What do you think that Herzl would feel about Israel as a state without a constitution?
Well, Herzl wrote in his Jewish state the idea of having a constitution, but the topic of the constitution is complex. Herzl had a very sort of hybrid views about democracy. In general, he was not for the idea of democracy in the way that we like to think about it. He was more of a proponent of some sort of aristocratic democracy, of maybe what we would call today constitutional monarchy, where there's an elite, could be a monarchy that has some sort of a long-term view and a reputation to defend. So yes, in the original version of the Jewish state, there is a constitution, but it's not something that Herzl, focused on. I think it's very difficult to take one element of Herzl's vision, as tempting as it is, and conclude that's the way it should be. I think Herzl, we can spend a lot of time studying his views about the balance of power, about who really runs government, about the issues of the civil service, about we talked about the power of the press, and apply it to our governance decision today.
The gentleman in the green sweater, right over
there. It's Jeff Dalby. Avi, by the way, I'm one of your longtime followers on Twitter. Avi, there have been any number of innovations at the Jerusalem Post over the years. Award-winning Jerusalem Post website, Jerusalem Post conferences. Your predecessors have done a great job. Sometime down the road, what will Avi Mayer's legacy innovation be? And I hope it will not be deploying artificial intelligence to write your articles.
Whew. I'm sweating here. My legacy. I hope my legacy is, first of all, a better website. I think we have a lot of work to do, and it's an okay website, but we can be doing better, even though we are getting 12 million unique visitors a month, making us by far the most read English language news outlet out of Israel or in the Jewish world. That's definitely something that I would like for us to improve. I think just generally improving our online presence is certainly something that I view as a priority, but really sort of establishing the Jerusalem Post or fortifying its role as the platform for the global Jewish conversation. I think we already are that to a large extent, but I think we can be doing it even better than we do today. I want us to be the place that people think of when they say, I want to know what the Jews are thinking at any given time. I want to know what the conversation is about. What are the issues that are on the minds of Jews around the world and of Israelis of all backgrounds within Israel? That, to my mind, is my number one priority. And I will say also being viewed as a fair and reasonable interlocutor by all segments of Israeli society and all parts of the Israeli political spectrum. I don't think it does us any favors to be viewed as being on one side of the political map or the other. I would like all Israeli leaders to view us as a place where they feel that they will have a fair platform and that their perspectives will be heard. I can tell you on the basis of the conversations I've been having in recent weeks with some of the most senior leaders in the country that they do view the Jerusalem Post as that place, and I would like for them to continue to do so.
Anyone else? Thought I saw a hand. Right over there. Then I need him.
Thank you very much. As word craftsmen, I would like to request that we do an abortion on the term anti-Semitism. It was a term founded in racism, which you know from Wilhelm Marr. We are not a racial group, and the proper term is hatred of the Jew. And for all those who have these sentiments, when they look in the mirror, they will know that they are haters, not anti-Semites. And you have the power to do that. So that is something I bring to you.
So I will, for a moment, put on my previous hat as a professional with the American Jewish Committee. While I was there, we commissioned the first ever surveys of both American Jews and the US general public on the subject of anti-Semitism in America. It had never been done before. And one of the questions we did ask, I believe in the second and then third iterations of the survey, was about exactly that. You know, does anti-Semitism mean anything to you? What does it actually mean? And can you understand
Most
what
people can't even spell it.
So what we found was actually interesting. The first year we asked that question, we found that a troubling number of non-Jews did not know what the term anti-Semitism was, or they'd either not heard of it at all, or they had heard of it but weren't sure what it meant. By the next year, more people had both heard of it and did know what it meant. And when we asked them if they understood what anti-Semitism meant versus Jew hatred, they actually believed that anti-Semitism was the more representative term for the phenomenon that we were trying to describe. So it is definitely a complex issue. I don't disagree. And there are certainly a lot of misunderstanding surrounding what is Semitism and why are you anti it and what does that mean exactly. And I think that it's interesting because sometimes people say, well, I'm anti-racist, I'm anti-bigotry, therefore I must be anti-Semitic. That's obviously not what we're going for. But when we actually delve into this question, that is something that we did pick up, something that we try to do at the Jerusalem Post, and I've tried to do in other platforms that I've been a part of, is sort of alternate between the two terms. So perhaps in the first instance, call it anti-Semitism, then when you're referring to it next, one paragraph down, switch to Jew hatred so that people understand that you're talking about the same thing.
Yeah, so many times when the term anti-Semitism is used, it's followed by a comma, then Jew hatred, and then a comma. So I still feel that it's better to abort the predicate and get to the real sense of the issue.
Fair enough.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Anybody else who wants to ask a question? That's it? Okay. All right, thank you so much, everyone. And Gol, if you want to plug your book one more time in the think tank, do you want to plug your book in the think tank one more time? No? Okay, thank you very much, everyone.
Yes. It's free. Okay.
I'm going to ask people to leave the auditorium if they can, when they can, because we need to clean up in here. Thank you.